I can still hear the first hiss of air brakes slicing through the manicured silence of our cul-de-sac. The streetlights caught chrome and reflective tape, turning the night into a runway of red and amber. Neighbors stood in bathrobes with phones raised, the board president clutching a folder like a shield and a sheriff's cruiser idling at the corner. At the end of that line of 18-wheelers stood me, holding a county-stamped folder of my own. The sign on my gate read exactly what the HOA never thought they'd see in their postcard-perfect subdivision. Private commercial access road. Authorized vehicles only. No one expected semi-trucks here. Not at midnight. Not ever. Not the neighborhood watchdogs who counted recycle bins and measured grass blades. Not the board that decided the strip of asphalt behind my house was theirs just because they liked using it. Not the folks who had taped bright orange violation notices to my mailbox for weeks, telling me what I could and could not do on land they didn't own. What rolled in behind those notices wasn't a moving van or a contractor's pickup or a landscaper's trailer. It was a fleet on a schedule, a lease in my desk, and a new definition of property lines loud enough to rattle picture frames. The first truck's turn signal pulsed against the smooth stucco walls in time with the thump of a distant diesel engine. Behind it came another, then two more, reflective vests fanning out like neon wings. As the crew guided them one by one onto the strip the board had christened a community amenity without ever asking who held the deed. The glow of an LED message board blinked a polite speed limit, the hiss of brakes, the low idle of engines, the metallic clink of hitches settling under load. It was a soundscape that said something far louder than any newsletter. I had played by the rules they couldn't write. There had been whispers when I posted the first new sign, rumors when the survey stakes went in, sprouting from the gravel like skinny orange periscopes, outrage when the city inspector showed up with a clipboard and left with a handshake, but nothing rattled them like the reality of headlights cresting the gentle rise, rolling over a border they'd drawn in their heads, not on any map. Their rules took up pages. Mine took up a single county-approved form and a line in a lease. Their fines came in flimsy paper envelopes. My invoice came stamped, notarized, and backed by a logistics company with a dispatch that never slept. People love to talk about quiet enjoyment until they get a lesson in quiet authority. What happened that night wasn't loud because of the engines. It was loud because of the sudden vacuum left when a bluff collapses. The board president, so confident in daytime emails, watched her argument evaporate under the weight of state statutes and an easement description older than half the homes here. The neighbors who had paraded their sympathy until the board was looking stood with their cameras shaking, not sure if they were capturing a betrayal or a correction. The deputy read a page, then another, then handed it back to me with a kind of shrug that only comes from recognizing which way the wind is actually blowing. No one cares about a driveway until it becomes a road. No one cares about a road until it becomes a lever. When they ignored the little boundary markers, I bought bigger ones. When they tried to fine me into submission, I turned fines into rent. When they mailed threats, I mailed contracts. And when they pretended my access was theirs to manage, I let a convoy of 18-wheelers illustrate where control really lived. It was never about noise. It was always about ownership. They gambled that I didn't understand mine. They were wrong. The irony was worth savoring. For months, their letters had told me to remove my signs to preserve the community aesthetic, to keep the strip open for strollers and joggers as if it were a park, to respect the harmony of shared spaces. They were never more certain about the boundary between private and common property than when it benefited their convenience. That night, the boundary glowed under headlights and hazard flashers and a line of trucks waiting for clearance. A clip-on name tag shook at the end of a chain, its owner blinking hard, realizing suddenly that paper only matters if it's the right paper. My document stack wasn't flashy, but it was precise, and it had the county seal in all the places that count. Revenge stories always sound like explosions. This one felt more like a drawstring pulled tight, inches at a time. The cord was tied months earlier, when the first letter used the word community as a weapon, and called my strip of asphalt a shared amenity. It tightened when board members started taking their morning power walks across my cameras, jotting notes about pebbles on the shoulder and the lack of HOA-approved paint on a post that was never theirs. It cinched when they escalated to threats of liens and denials of permits they didn't control. By the time the trucks arrived, that string was a lifeline with a tugboat at the end of it. Pull hard enough, something gives. There is a moment in any confrontation when motives flip inside out. The board stopped looking like stewards and started looking like trespassers when the sheriff's flashlight hit the meets and bounds on my plat map. Neighbors stopped looking like victims of change and started looking like beneficiaries of entitlement when the lease number reflected in someone's car window and they realized this wasn't a hobby project. I stopped looking like the quiet guy at the end of the street and started looking like what I had been for years without anyone noticing. The owner of a narrow, inconvenient, unremarkable piece of asphalt that mattered a lot once someone else pretended it didn't. It is a dangerous thing to mistake patience for weakness. I had been patient while their newsletters mischaracterized my lot line. I had been patient while they removed signs I reinstalled. I had been patient while they talked loudly within earshot about getting a vote together to absorb my strip into the association, as if votes could erase deeds. That night was not the end of patience. It was the end of pretending patience needed to be the only tool. Trucks did not rumble to settle a score. They rolled because I chose to use my property the way the law allowed, not the way a handful of neighbors wished it would conform. If you've ever had a moment where the thing you were right about becomes visible to everyone at once, you know the quiet afterward. That quiet stretched across the cul-de-sac after the last tractor eased its trailer along the edge, after reflective vests faded back into silhouettes, after engines idled low like distant waves. The neighborhood had spent months inventing versions of who I was and what I would do. The truth arrived on 18 wheels and parked between their assumptions and the corner of my deed. The board would later call an emergency meeting. They would hire a lawyer who spoke the language of documents I had already read. They would try to turn back a clock they didn't set, but that would come later, in fluorescent light, around a folding table nobody enjoyed sitting at. In this moment, there was the smell of warmed asphalt, the faint vibration underfoot, the metallic sighs of machines doing a job, and the certainty that the next letter addressed to me would read very differently. Stories like this always start the same way, with a little piece of ground someone thinks is nobody's or everybody's because it's useful to think that way. They end when someone with a title and a stationery set runs out of paper that works. Between those points, there are choices. I had already made mine. I turned a driveway into a boundary marker you could hear from 3 blocks away, before the first notice, before the first survey stake, before a sign that made them scoff and a permit that made them blink. That night, as the deputy handed my paperwork back and the lights washed over a street that was suddenly more honest than it had been at dinner time, the story had already been written. It just needed a narrator who knew where to start. It started months before, with a road nobody noticed until someone decided to own it for me. Months before the night the trucks rolled, the road behind my fence barely registered as anything but a shortcut for pollen and pine needles. It was a narrow black ribbon with a crown of crushed granite shoulders, older than the stucco around it, older than the neighborhood mail kiosk and the ornamental ponds with their bored pairs of mallards. On the original survey, it had a plain name that read like a shrug: Private Ingress, Egress, Parcel 17A. On the ground, it looked like convenience. And convenience has a way of making people forget who pays to keep it from washing out in a storm. I had bought the end lot for the quiet and the workshop space, not for the sliver of asphalt. The lot was a quirky flag shape, a rectangle for the house with a long tongue reaching the collector road behind the subdivision. The access tongue was the reason the developer could stitch the place together years ago without landlocking a stubborn farmer who wouldn't sell, and it stayed a private attachment even after the farmhouse finally became another beige dream with a 2-car garage. The tongue mattered less to realtors than the granite countertops, but it mattered to me. A dedicated back way meant deliveries to my shop didn't have to snake past minivans and chalk drawings. It meant I wasn't boxed in by a security gate and a committee. Hawthorne Ridge sold itself as a tapestry of community, and like most tapestries, it was most impressive when you didn't look too closely at the stitches. The HOA newsletter came printed on thick paper with pastel clip art, garden hoses coiled just so, lawn chairs arranged at right angles, stylized dogs on leashes smiling into the middle distance. Rules had the same glossy finish, with sections for grass height and mailbox uniformity, and approved paint swatches with names like Sand Dollar and Fog. The board presidency rotated between a handful of people who wore the same branded polo to every meeting, and referred to the architect as if he lived inside the binder of design guidelines. The board president, when I moved in, was a woman who carried a folder like a sword. She had the posture of permanence, the kind of stance that told you she was used to directing traffic without a uniform. Her leadership style showed up in the minutes as emphatic adjectives, and in the common areas as new signs reminding everyone of things they already knew. If you wanted to picture her, imagine a name tag that swung at the end of a chain whenever she gestured toward a violation. Behind her was a small cohort who made the rules feel bigger by walking in a pack. They moved in the early mornings, spandex and sunscreen and mirrored sunglasses, and they treated my backstrip like an accomplishment they had built. Strollers rattled over the edge, joggers cut the corner off the sidewalk to shave a few steps, dog walkers waved as if they were being gracious by acknowledging a route they had adopted. The first time I set a simple aluminum sign at the entrance, private road, no unauthorized access, the sign lasted 2 afternoons. It came back to me wearing a scratch, as if it had gotten in a fight with a hedge. It didn't take long for the language in the newsletter to start using the word community like a crowbar. There was a paragraph about adopting underutilized paths for walkers. There was a sentence about enhancing connectivity that used my access tongue in a way that made it sound like a public good. The board posted a pastel map with a dotted line running right up my strip, as if graphics could redraft a deed. The following week, a galvanized bench appeared on the shoulder, stenciled with the HOA's initials. The bench faced a line of wax myrtles and the back fence of a house with a porch swing. It did not face anything anyone would want to look at if they had a choice. But the bench wasn't about views, it was about stakes in the ground. I didn't make a scene. I repainted my sign with reflective letters and mounted it higher. I trimmed the shoulders so nobody could claim it was neglected. I swept after the pine storms. I moved the bench half a foot back onto the HOA's turf and took a photo with my phone and a timestamp. Then I did what my father taught me when he used to trace plat maps at the dining room table for clients who thought personality trumped property lines. I went to the county. The records room smelled like old paper and toner. The clerk found the right book with practiced ease, palms flipping pages that listed a language with a cadence all its own. Meets and bounds, bearings and distances, feet and chains, partial releases and transfers of rights. My strip appeared on paper like a thin vein connecting two larger parcels. It had been carved out decades earlier when the old farm sold everything but the house and a way to keep moving tractors and feed. The description was clear and unromantic. Private ingress, egress for the benefit of parcel 17, its owner and assigns, including use for delivery of materials, equipment, and livestock associated with lawful use of the dominant estate. The words were simple until someone wanted to pretend they didn't matter. Assigns was the kind of word people skipped until it mattered a lot. The HOA's master plat was in a different book, printed later and colored in, with smooth blocks of green for common areas and cul-de-sacs with cheerful names. Tract F, Community Greenway, stopped cleanly before my line. The long tongue of parcel 17A barely seemed to belong. It had a small label that looked like it had been added as an afterthought. The association's attorney had drawn a hard edge there once, and it had stayed hard on paper, even while softening underfoot as neighbors wore a path with their morning loops. The map didn't care about loops, it cared about chains and pins, and where someone had set a rebar stake in the dirt when the subdivision was born. It's always funny how private feels until public convenience wants a piece of it. When a utility crew needed to get at a junction box near the end of my strip, they asked, and I opened the gate, and we figured it out. When a neighbor's contractor misread the GPS and tried to come through, I redirected him without drama. When the board started sending glossy paragraphs about connectivity and adoption, the tone changed. The first formal letter arrived printed on thick letterhead that matched the newsletter. It referred to my strip as a community asset and requested removal of unauthorized signage. It included a screenshot from a drone of our cul-de-sac like a realtor's listing and circled the access tongue in a hopeful blue. The certified letters were followed by informal gestures. A volunteer weeding crew pulled a section of my wildflowers. Someone stenciled little footprints near the entrance on a morning I left early for work. The board posted a photo on the HOA portal of children chalking a hopscotch grid with a caption about shared spaces. It was difficult to argue with chalk and smiles without sounding like a villain. That was the trick, and they knew it. Meanwhile, the property management company's online portal sprouted a violation for unapproved signage, a $50 line item that wasn't due but looked like a tab somebody could add to if they needed leverage later. I could have cut the signs bigger and dug them deeper and played tug of war with the same stakes. Instead, I laid string. Surveyors call it control. I hired a licensed crew to shoot the line and set fresh markers where the old ones had sunk under grass. Orange lath grew along the shoulder, each one topped with a flag that snapped softly in the breeze. The surveyor's assistant showed me the pin at the entrance, a solid steel rod that sat exactly where the plat said it should, 2 inches below the soil line. I took more photos with more timestamps. I printed a copy of the meets and bounds so clean it looked like a menu. Along with the survey, I requested a copy of the county's current transportation ordinance. It wasn't light reading, but it made a simple point over and over. The county cared about safety, sight lines, axle weights, and damage to public pavement. It did not care about association politics. There was a section on pre-existing private farm roads and their conversion to other lawful uses. There were permits for curb cuts and improvements if the surface met certain load-bearing criteria. There were noise ordinances and hours of operation recommendations. Buried in a footnote was the echo of the old language I had read in the records room. Where long-established private access existed to a collector road, owners could assign rights of passage to others by written agreement, subject to compliance with safety codes and state law. I printed that section and tacked it inside my shop door, not as a plan yet, but as a warning to myself that I had options beyond writing stern emails. Options calm people down. Options keep you from jumping at shadows. Options remind you to remain boring while someone else performs outraged theatrics. The tipping point happened on a Tuesday afternoon when the HOA sent a new newsletter with a subtitle that felt like it had been workshopped: Community Trail Enhancement. In the accompanying photo, a portable post hole digger leaned against my fence, and a volunteer in a visor posed behind a roll of orange plastic fencing at the edge of my strip. The board had scheduled a trail day. The map extended the dotted line all the way to the collector road beyond my gate. There was a line item in the budget for crushed granite and a cost estimate for bollards. They had given my private road a name with path in it. I walked my strip that evening with a measuring tape and a pocket notebook. I wrote down distances and slopes and where the rain pool collected in the slight dip near the midpoint. I noted the grade from my gate to the collector road. I counted mailboxes and branches that would need trimming if tall vehicles ever used the access. I wasn't making a promise to myself yet. I was learning the terrain. The last page of my notebook that night had 2 columns. One was labeled enforcement paths they might try. The other was labeled levers I actually have. In the first column, I wrote fines, liens, PR shaming, proxy votes. In the second, I wrote deed, survey, county, assigns. The certified letter arrived 2 days later. It came with a bright sticker warning me to sign for it, as if its contents were a perishable truth. Inside, the words were less pastel and more steel. Notice of violation and corrective action plan. Remove unauthorized signage. Cease restricting community access. Comply within 14 days to avoid daily assessments. It was signed with the president's looping name and CC'd to the association's legal counsel, which is HOA, for we asked a lawyer how to spell this threat. I set the letter beside the plat and the county ordinance and my notebook. The access tongue on the paper looked thin. The words looked thicker. In the distance, a jogger's footsteps tamped the shoulder as if marking time. The bench with the HOA stencil watched the fence with the same blank expression as ever. On the association portal, the message board thread about our new path collected likes. Somewhere on social media, a neighbor I had never met posted a picture of my sign with a caption about selfishness and gates. The ground was level. The stakes were bright. The paper was ready. The next chapter would determine who actually understood what the word own meant when convenience stopped being the only consideration. The certified letter didn't make me angry so much as it made me precise. Anger loves noise. Precision prefers paper. I assembled a packet that looked unremarkable unless you cared about words like exhibit and attachment. At the top was a calm cover letter referencing their notice by its exact date and code. Behind it, a copy of the deed with the access language highlighted, the fresh survey with bright stamps and signatures, photos of the bench nudged onto their side, screenshots of the HOA's own plat map stopping short of my line, and the county ordinance section about pre-existing private roads. The last page was a request, not a threat, that they remove any association fixtures from my property and cease encouraging the public to use it. The packet went certified both to the management office and to the president at her home because precise things should not be able to pretend they got lost. In return, the portal sprouted fines like mushrooms after rain. Unauthorized signage got a dollar amount. Obstruction of community path got another. Failure to comply with corrective action multiplied daily like a parking meter. The numbers weren't ruinous, but their cadence was obvious. If intimidation by letterhead didn't work, a stack of pretend debts might. A notice appeared warning that future architectural requests for my lot could be delayed until compliance. It was pure HOA theater, the kind of blocking and scripted menace that depends on the target forgetting which stage they're actually standing on. Then came the trail day. They posted photos of wheelbarrows and cheerful volunteers, stakes laid out like a kindergarten art project along the shoulder of an area that was not theirs. I took the afternoon off work and sat in my shop with the bay door up, cameras running, coffee going cold. A white canopy appeared at the entrance like a concession stand. Orange plastic fencing unrolled in the breeze, its pattern of little diamonds catching the light. A borrowed post hole digger powered up and whined through soil that belonged to me. A volunteer tapped a yard of rebar and smiled for a phone. I didn't step outside my fence. I used the county app and logged a call about trespass with attachments labeled in a way that could be handed to a judge without a word changed. A sheriff's cruiser eased into the cul-de-sac as if it were arriving at a yard sale. The deputy took statements without theatrics. He stood with the plat map I had printed, and the survey photo and the county ordinance. He walked to the shoulder and found the pin with the toe of his boot. The steel that makes philosophy turn into something you can feel when you tap it. He didn't need my opinion, which is the best kind of help there is. After he left, the orange fencing sagged into a board curve and the canopy blew against its own legs. The board's response was a new breed of letter with the word council in the signature block. It alleged implied dedication, a phrase that sounds soft and neighborly until it arrives with a citation. In their telling, long public use had softened private into public like water smoothing stone. It was a confident paragraph built on a slippery premise, the legal equivalent of trying to claim a seat because you've sat in it before. They cited neighborhood runs and strollers, and the fact that nobody had objected loudly enough until now. The implication was that quiet permission had hardened into permanent grace. I sent something back that was not loud but was louder than before. It was a recorded affidavit, notarized ink on paper, filed at the county, that stated exactly what the law expects an owner to state when convenience starts calling itself right. It declared that any past pedestrian use of my strip had been permissive, revocable, and subject to my control, and that I objected to any claim of public dedication or prescriptive easement. It included photos of signs over the years, timestamps of me moving the bench back, images of flags marking the line. It was a mechanical document, unglamorous and weight-bearing. I posted a new sign at the entrance with the same message in 10 words, backed by the code section. The myth that 100 joggers equals a deed had just run out of breath. With paper in the recorder's office cooling under a stamp, I walked the road with a contractor who measured differently than the HOA volunteers. He crouched and chipped at the edge of the asphalt, looking at aggregate size and binder. He checked slopes and shoulders, springs and culverts, pullouts and sightlines to the collector road. He recited load ratings and compaction percentages, and how many inches of crushed base it would take to make the strip behave like a grown-up road. The county's driveway permit for commercial access was not a fantasy, it was a punch list. The old farm road had bones, it needed muscle. While measurements became a quote, I formed a shell Excel that matched the plan in my notebook. A single-member LLC with a plain name that said exactly what it did and nothing more. An EIN printed on a paper that smelled like new toner. A certificate of insurance that a dispatcher could hand to a risk manager without making a face. A draft of a license agreement that used the word assigns with the same clarity as the deed I had found weeks earlier in a dusty book. The HOA responded the way trapped energy always does. It tried to find a new seam in the rock. They posted a special meeting about annexing underutilized adjacent tracts into the association. They canvassed porches with flyers that used my strip's nickname like it had already been theirs. They floated polling language that suggested votes could lasso property by sheer volume of signatures. Neighbors took photos of me measuring slopes and posted them with captions about industrializing the neighborhood. The management company added a niche violation for visible waste bins to my portal on a day the bins had been placed out 40 minutes before the allowed time. A snapshot framed my open garage door with a ladder in view and called it storage visible from street. The board president paced past my fence in quick circuits, her binder tucked like a shield. When the paving trucks arrived for the base course, the HOA learned something they had always suspected but never researched. County permits don't include an HOA CCR checkbox. The inspector's tablet glowed with the permit number I had pulled that morning, issued after plan review and a fee that stung a little and then felt worth every dollar. He checked silt fencing and erosion control. He marked where a silt sock needed to go to protect a storm drain. He nodded at the mix and the compaction test. He never asked whether a committee liked the color. A different inspector from a different department took an interest in the bench the HOA had left straddling my line. He measured its legs relative to the pin and the edge. He took a photo with a timestamp. He left the association a notice about encroachment, a polite correction in official language, the inverse of the pages they had mailed me. 2 days later, the bench disappeared the way my first sign had, quietly and with no acknowledgement. Upgrades changed the feel of the strip. The new base laid down like a promise. Fresh gravel shoulders held their shape. A shallow swale pulled water away from the crown and carried it to the ditch it was always meant to find. Reflective posts went in at intervals, their faces catching sun in neat dots. The old farm romance was gone. In its place was something honest that could do a job. I had been in touch with a logistics company long enough to recognize their cadence. Need came like weather, forecastable, with fronts that stalled and then surged. Their yard across the collector road had grown faster than their curb cut could handle. Dispatch needed another gate, somewhere trucks could slip out and back in without breathing the cul-de-sac air. My little strip had looked like a toy until the exact moment it fit their puzzle. I sent them the LLC certificate and the insurance binder and a draft license that described hours, weights, indemnities, maintenance obligations, and a monthly rate with a modifier for 24/7. The reply came back not as a breathless yes, but as a red-lined draft with tweaks that told me a lawyer had sighed over it and found it acceptable. As the road took its new skin, the HOA tried to accelerate the narrative online. Posts appeared about noise and safety and property values. Photos of trucks in other parts of town were used as stand-ins for what my road might unleash. Words like industrial, blight, and nuisance bobbed like buoys on a tide. Then came the rumor that I was running a business from my home in violation of the CCRs. It morphed into a portal violation titled commercial activity, which was as close as a database could get to making a hunch sound official. I printed out the county ordinance for home-based businesses, not because I needed it yet, but because paper calms, and because I suspected the HOA would discover its limits one section at a time. Their attorney filed for a temporary restraining order to stop any heavy vehicles pending a hearing. The request was elegant and urgent, a stack of paper shoulders thrown against a door. My attorney's reply treated the door like it was already open and measured the hinges. The judge looked at deeds and survey and permits and the fact that no trucks had yet used the road. He declined to grant an emergency halt to a hypothetical harm. The paper the HOA wanted to waive as a stop sign went back into their folder as another receipt that would later have to be explained to people who dislike receipts. As the permit stickers dried on their backing and the new road sheen cured, the association tried one more maneuver that looked bold until it hit a boundary. They tried to record a plat amendment showing my strip shaded the same green as Tract F. The recorder's office slid it back across the counter. You cannot color what you do not own. They would eventually learn that some walls are not the kind you can argue with. On my side of the fence, tasks ticked down a list. I ordered speed limit signs that looked boring and official. I placed reflective tape on the fence posts nearest the crown. I installed a small LED board that could display a schedule if needed and a caution if weather turned. I budgeted for quarterly seal coat and a line item for shoulder repair after heavy rains. I put aside a portion of the license fee for a tire wash station in case mud ever became an issue. It was not vengeance, it was operations. I sent one last letter to the board, not with bluster, but with mathematics. It offered to sell them a recorded easement for pedestrian use during daylight hours in exchange for a fair market one-time payment and a maintenance agreement that would hold them to the same standards as anyone else who used the strip. It gave them 30 days. The silence that followed was heavy with certainty that they could force more for less. I let the silence stretch and called dispatch. On the day the county rubber-stamped the permit and the insurance carrier emailed the binder naming the HOA as an additional insured out of sheer prudence, the logistics company sent a a schedule. It was a spreadsheet dressed in simple cells, a metronome of arrivals and departures through the night when most people slept and the roads were honest about who actually used them. The first date was a week out. The first hour was late enough that this would feel like a rumor until the first amber beacon cut through it. Neighbors kept posting. The board kept finding. My portal balance looked like Monopoly money slid across a table by a player who didn't realize the game had changed. The road sat quiet and ready. The dispatch board lit up. The next chapter would be the one everyone remembered, not because the engines were loud, but because paper had turned into something with wheels. The night the schedule went live, the strip felt different before a single headlight curved over the crown. It wasn't louder, it was taut. Cones lined the shoulder in disciplined intervals. Reflective posts threw back the streetlights like quiet sentries. The new cantilever gate stood open and pinned, its hinges oiled to silence. A portable LED board pulsed a dull amber caution, and a speed advisory so unremarkable it felt official by default. A laminated placard on the fence carried contact numbers for dispatch and a maintenance hotline. The county permit sticker sat inside a clear sleeve near the entrance, opposite the recorded affidavit number like bookends. In the hours leading up to the first arrival, the association tried to make reality blink. The portal fed out a stream of warnings and an urgent email about a community watch. Lawn chairs appeared at the edge of the cul-de-sac as if a parade were due. Chalk bloomed on the sidewalk with messages that faded under the first evening breeze. A folding table sprouted a stack of printed flyers urging caution around a path that did not exist on any recorded document. The board president made small loops past the entrance, binder against her ribs like a shield, her eyes moving in quick cuts to the sign, the permit sticker, the placard with numbers that suggested systems larger than a committee. I had prepared the way people prepare when they want the only surprises to be weather. My attorney sent a courtesy copy of the license agreement to the sheriff's office. Dispatch forwarded a courtesy schedule to the same deputy who had found the pin with his boot. I emailed the county inspector who had checked compaction and silt fencing and let him know that if any call came in, the operation times were already in his file, and the noise ordinance thresholds were not guesswork for me, but measurements recorded by 3 small decibel meters tucked under eaves and fence caps. The insurance carrier had issued a certificate naming the HOA as an additional insured for operations on or adjacent to common areas, a belt and suspenders courtesy that made no legal concession and accomplished a single purpose. If anyone tried to conjure chaos from worry, a risk manager would recognize a language that belonged to them. Around 11:30, a last-minute tactic bubbled up. Sprinklers along the HOA's nearest strip stuttered to life, arcing water across their grass, through the fence slats, and in thin veils over my shoulders. The arc barely reached the crown, more nuisance than hazard, but it glittered under streetlight as if someone had set a stage. A county drought notice lived quietly on the HOA's own portal that week about restricted watering hours. The inspector, alerted not by me but by routine patrols through the precinct's shared incident log, slid by in an unmarked county truck and watched the arcs etch their wasted loops. He took a photo. He shut a valve with a calm twist. The sprinklers hissed down to silence. On the HOA's portal not an hour later, the drought notice acquired a second line about fines. The irony sat there in the backlight, not loud and large. At 11:52 p.m., the first set of headlamps cut across the collector road. White light found the reflective faces of the posts and turned them into a breadcrumb trail. The truck's turn signal pulsed amber against stucco facades and the polished sides of SUVs. A reflective vest moved in the near field, then another, and the air carried the layered scents of warmed rubber and diesel treated to an inch of compliance. The hiss of brakes eased the rig to a pause at the entrance, while a safety officer checked the crown and the entry angle. The LED board scrolled a steady advisory. My cameras filmed from sensible angles with timestamps and dates in the corner, not as a dare, but as a record that could be handed to a mediator or a judge without a caption changed. The HOA contingent had not planned for how quiet professionalism can look in the middle of a protest built on the expectation of spectacle. There was no honking, no revving, no horns puncturing the night. The truck glided onto the strip the way a proper vehicle glides into a proper lane, and the first pair of phones tilted, their sensors fighting the wash of bright light. The board president stepped forward to the edge of the shoulder, calculated the tow line against the flag that marked the property line, and stalled against something nobody enjoys meeting head-on, the boundary between performance and consequence. The deputy who had taken the courtesy copy pulled into the cul-de-sac without dramatic speed and idled at an angle that made his headlights awash and not a weapon. He had read the permit numbers on his way. He had the case number for the denied restraining order in his notes. He stood where posture and paper meet, and his presence put weight where it was needed. Behind the first truck came a second, its turn signal pulsing a steady counterpoint. The logistics crew moved like practice choreography, radios clipped, boots finding their places without fuss. They wore the kind of vests that mean their safety officer had walked a property more than once and stamped the risks into a worksheet that went to a supervisor who cared more about reduced incident rates than internet threads. The first rig eased along the crown, dropped its speed below the placard's advisory, and made the shallow climb with tires that stayed exactly where they were supposed to stay. Neighbors who had predicted concrete shaking vibrations felt a low hum and the faint tremor of big equipment moving deliberately, less a roar than a thickened heartbeat underfoot. The HOA's last stand took a less dramatic form than a human chain and a more common one. A folding barricade that had been sitting at the edge of the grass found its way into the path, carried by hands that carefully avoided stepping over the survey flags. It looked official from 10 steps away and like plastic from 2. The safety officer stopped the first truck with a raised hand. The crew walked a few yards to the barricade, checked its legs. The deputy stepped closer, glanced at the pin, the flag, the fence slat, the barricade's toe, and then back to the position of the tires. The barricade returned to where it had been. The rig eased forward. Phones captured pixels with no seizure to show for it. The moment of greatest imagined drama became a study in boring procedure, and boredom is the enemy of panic. On the HOA portal, a moderator posted an update midstream using a steadying voice that tried to reframe a loss as a process. The thread's earlier adjectives, industrial, blight, assault, took on the air of theater critics after the electric went out. Behind the performance of concern, an administrative hiccup turned into a stumble. Because the HOA had been named as an additional insured out of courtesy, its insurance broker had received the same schedule and the same safety plan I had sent the county. The broker's after-hours desk sent an email to the board president's inbox, reminding her of the limits of the association's control over adjacent private property. Risk managers are not glamorized in these stories, but they run a quiet empire of reality checks. Their language is bland and gently immutable. That email would surface later, with an awkward subject line and date stamp, and close the door on decisions that had no footing. The second truck rolled with the same unhurried posture as the first. The road flexed under the load like a muscle that understood its new job. A low-hanging limb that the HOA had refused to trim when it was just a jogger's annoyance brushed the top of a trailer door and shed a few dry leaves. They spiraled to the asphalt and whispered across the crown. The crew leader made a note for the next day's trim list. The HOA landscape contractor, who had been told to halt any services near my line pending the outcome of a legal strategy, would receive a correction order from the association a week later to address that very limb because optics demanded penance. The line between looking responsive and being responsible thinned to a thread. As the third truck's hazard lights blinked their metronome, a pair of patrol units rolled through on a separate call somewhere 2 streets over, and slowed with the universal curiosity of people who see lights and think trouble. They saw organization instead. One officer made a small, slow turn, read a placard, and kept going. The other checked that the parked cars did not create a choke point and kept going. The arrival of extra authority with nowhere to apply itself read like punctuation at the end of a sentence the HOA had wanted to write. Sometimes the show refuses to be staged. Calls went into the county complaint line anyway because people need to fulfill their own prophecies. The log tagged them behind the scenes and dispatched the inspector who had walked the permit. He pulled up in his unmarked non-police vehicle, took a decibel meter reading from the sidewalk, watched the numbers sit in a range that the ordinance itself had printed in its own pages, took a picture of the LED board's advisory for a file that would be reviewed by nobody unless someone insisted. He nodded to the deputy, not as a signal of camaraderie against a foe, but the curt recognition that 2 separate departments were present at a scene that needed neither. The most intimate embarrassment came not from an argument lost at the curb, but from a realization in a kitchen lit by a phone screen. On the HOA management portal, where fines had stacked like marbles rolling into a jar, a quiet entry appeared tagged in a category the board had not noticed before: pending legal outcome hold. The management company, having looked at the denial of the restraining order and the recorded affidavit and the county permit sitting in a public database, moved the automated violations into a holding pattern that silently told the board that their leverage was now an accounting footnote. The fines did not go away, but they no longer grew teeth. The association had imagined a rolling tally that could be converted into a lien if needed. What they had was a paper tiger wearing a very bright pastel shirt. By the fourth truck, the line of lawn chairs had thinned to a few deflated cushions. The chalk messages took on a washed look. The sprinkler arcs, having been cut off, left dark arcs in the HOA's grass that would show up as crescents until the next rain. A neighbor who had been performing outrage with 10-second video clips found their camera lens fogging slightly in the humid night and gave up on capturing spectacle that refused to arrive. The board president's binder lost some of its armor as gravity dragged down its topmost papers. The deputy talked into a shoulder mic with the bored cadence of a man logging a presence. He shifted his weight, checked a watch, scanned a scene that produced nothing worth narrating in a report beyond the correct spelling of names and the presence of posted permit numbers. The logistics crew waved the fifth truck through with the ease of a team that had rehearsed. There were no grinding turns, no curb hops, no crushed mailbox posts. The tires kissed the crown, the axles took the slope, the brakes hissed, the idles settled, and the night held. My decibel meters fed data to a cloud account where green bars stacked in calm repetition below thresholds, adopted by a committee that had cared about restaurants with patios and not private roads at midnight. In the morning, when a neighbor posted a clip about the alleged thunder of the night, numbers could respond with a kind of indifference that infuriates people who have invested in adjectives. Somewhere after midnight, as the sixth rig disappeared onto the collector road, the HOA's emergency meeting blinked onto computer screens. Little boxes held faces lit by blue light and the glow of frustration. They spoke in the language of committees, motions and seconds and points of order, wrapped in the hum of appliances and the occasional bark of a dog who wasn't interested in bylaws. They tried to shepherd fury into a plan. It kept slipping through. The attorney who had filed the earlier TRO slid into the meeting late with the kind of fatigue professionals wear when clients ask them to flip statutes like pancakes. He had brought a legal pad and a few references. He had not brought magic. By 2 a.m., the convoy was a rhythm. The last rig for the night slid along the crown, and the LED board switched to a static caution. The deputy left with a small wave of taillights. The county inspector updated a log with a note about compliance. The HOA lawn chairs folded into their awkward shapes and went back to garages where holiday wreaths and inflatable lawn decorations waited for more forgiving seasons. Phones dimmed, screens shut, the strip exhaled. The hum faded to the ambient crickets and the distant tires on the collector road that had always been there long before this neighborhood existed. The morning would bring new types of messages. The management portal would feature a link to a special board session. A small envelope with the association's return address would arrive at my mailbox with a tone so changed it could have passed as a different species. A neighbor who had posted nightly outrage would post instead a careful question about compromise and hours of operation. The logistics company would email me an incident-free report and a note confirming the schedule could scale without noise. But all of that belonged to the resolution and the long shadow of impact. In the quiet at the end of the first night, the thing that mattered most was not that trucks had rolled. It was that the story finally matched the map. Morning delivered the first pivot with a kind of formality that tries to look like neighborliness. The envelope in my mailbox wore the association's crest and the familiar return address, but the tone on the page had shed its pastel muscles. It requested a conversation about mutual accommodations and community harmony. It referenced the prior night with neutral nouns, as if the trucks were weather instead of choices. It suggested exploring options to preserve neighborhood enjoyment. It did not mention implied dedication or corrective action plans. It did not cite a code. The thud in the language came from something that had finally hit a boundary it could not argue with. By then, the metrics had already started replacing adjectives. The decibel meters had logged an uneventful night. My cameras showed wide turns that were not wide at all. The county inspector's note sat in a database with a green stamp on compliance. The deputy's report, thin and typo-free, recorded presence and nothing to correct. The logistics company sent a tidy incident sheet with a blank under the word damage. The HOA management portal, which had looked like a slot machine for a few weeks, parked the fines in a limbo the software called Pending Legal Outcome Hold, an internal designation that tells a board exactly how little leverage they actually have when a recorder's stamp and a judge's denial sit on the other side of the table. I did not slam any doors shut. I scheduled the meeting they requested and set it on a weekday afternoon at a neutral conference room with a glass wall facing a parking lot full of ordinary cars. I brought my attorney, not for teeth, but for alignment with the same reality that had kept the first night uneventful. On the table went the same stack of paper that had outlasted the most energetic email thread the association had ever generated, deed language with its unfussy assigns, the fresh survey with signatures, the recorded affidavit that killed any romance about prescriptive rights, the county permit, the insurance certificate that named the HOA as an additional insured out of courtesy, and nothing more. There was a new document across the top, one that was neither a threat nor a capitulation. It was a term sheet. The term sheet read like a grocery list for a quiet outcome. If the association wanted trucks to stop using the strip, the numbers were not mysterious. The logistics license had a minimum term and a carefully calculated early termination fee that compensated for mobilization, planning, and capacity carved into a schedule that did not scale down and up without cost. The improvements to the road had a real price. The time and legal fees had receipts. There was also a premium that anyone who has ever negotiated a buyout understands without needing it explained. The cost to make a nuisance someone else's problem sooner than the calendar would do it on its own. It included conditions that were not aesthetic but structural. Permanent acknowledgments recorded in the same public books the board had once assumed could be rewritten by votes and feelings, a non-interference covenant, a mutual release, a rescission of all fines and violations accompanied by a letter clarifying to the entire membership that the strip had never been and would never be an association amenity absent recorded rights. A provision for my dues paid ahead for a span long enough to discourage the next bright idea about weaponizing the portal. A line that required the HOA to fund and maintain a separate community path on land it actually owned, relieving my strip permanently of the burden of being dressed up as a trail. They were not thrilled with the premium. People who have fought their way into a cul-de-sac of sunk cost rarely are. Their new counsel, a real estate attorney whose yellow pad looked like an old friend, did the math anyway, and the math refused to lie. Long-term litigation with a low chance of victory and a high chance of expense would eat reserves and goodwill. The trucks would keep rolling under county permits written in boring, stubborn ink. The rumors about property values would confront sales data instead of fear. An election would arrive with its own arithmetic, and a pile of legal invoices would be an easy campaign flyer for anyone who understood anger better than law. The judge who had denied their emergency request would be the same judge who would see them again if they tried a second round. The logic lined up like pavers. There was a way to step across without twisting an ankle. It simply required admitting what they had been unwilling to admit before engines and green stamps forced the issue. The meeting ended without handshakes. Everyone recognized that reversing momentum would cost. The board scheduled an emergency session and then a special meeting for the membership. The flyers went out with careful language about protecting neighborhood peace, which is HOA for spending money people would rather not spend. The portal hosted a thread that started hot and slowly burned down to the coals of exhaustion. Quiet homeowners who had watched the saga with a kind of resigned disbelief began to ask simple questions about budgets and reserves. This is how enthusiasm surrenders to arithmetic. The treasurer posted a summary of legal expenses to date. Numbers toppled the rhetoric like dominoes. The vote authorized negotiations to acquire either the strip outright or the right to limit its use. What the bylaws could not do, dollars could. They still could not annex what they did not own. They could, however, buy my freedom to use it a certain way if I agreed to sell it. The license I held became the pivot. The logistics company, professional to the end, treated my inquiry like a business decision. There was a price for early termination. There was a timeline they would accept to build a new gate at their yard's western edge and carve a second curb cut that would bleed pressure away from the collector road at higher cost to the company and zero cost to me if the HOA paid the fee. The dispatch manager, who liked reliable schedules more than romantic fights, gave me dates with a grace period to keep everybody's blood pressure in range. I built the purchase into my term sheet like a little machine. To stop trucks now, the association would buy the remainder of the license term at its early termination rate, reimburse my build costs with a modest escalator, cover legal expenses to date, prepay my dues for a decade, and fund a separate recorded path project on HOA land within 6 months, with a maintenance reserve attached, so I would never be asked to let a stroller cross my strip under the euphemism of temporary. In exchange, I would record a limited-use easement favoring the association that let residents walk through during daylight hours only, strictly pedestrian, separated from the crown by a physical barrier the HOA would pay to build and maintain. No bikes, no strollers with wheels so wide they would cross the line, no carts, no events. The language was dull in the way protective language is dull. It did not invite interpretation wide enough to drive a movement through. Between those discussions and their conclusion, the convoy continued with a rhythm that slowly bled the neighborhood of interest in outrage. The trucks did not wake babies because their engines idled low, and the LED board's advisory kept speed sedate, and because reality rarely lives up to the worst-case image shoved into a feed at midnight. The landscape crew, suddenly allowed to trim the limb that had brushed a trailer, restored the top of the crown to its intended clearance. The decibel meters whispered more identical bars. A broker listed a home 2 doors down. It sold for an unremarkable price to a family who cared less about a few late-night rigs they could barely hear than about the school district and the kitchen island. The narrative about falling values evaporated in the light of funded closings. The board president's posture softened the way posture does when people realize they've been given bad advice by themselves. She missed a meeting the vice president chaired. New volunteers emerged with an energy that had less to do with rage and more with the sudden possibility of a board that behaved like a steward instead of a hall monitor. The management company posted a procedural update. Any claim of common area ownership would henceforth require recorded instruments attached to real descriptions, not maps edited with dotted lines and hope. The newsletter toned down its clip art. Quiet competence crept in through the cracks. The association's insurance broker, quietly delighted to usher their client away from unnecessary risk, placed a coverage memo on the president's desk. It explained, in neutral language, the difference between liability assumed in a contract and liability created by overreach. It suggested, with the kind of polite insistence that actuaries have perfected, that antagonizing adjacent private owners was not a coverage strategy. It recommended a risk committee. In the emotionally exuberant world of HOA politics, The presence of a risk committee is the equivalent of a cold compress. It does not win elections. It does reduce claims. Negotiations ended where they had to end, with numbers and signatures. The special assessment passed by a hair because fear of trucks made for strange alliances with people who otherwise spent very little time thinking about easements and meets and bounds. At the title office, under fluorescent lights and a framed poster of a mountain lake, we closed like adults. The wire landed in my account with a number large enough to be a local story if I traded discretion for clicks, and just ordinary enough that nobody would write a book about it. The association recorded the limited use easement with its neutral verbs and its restrictions, and filed the non-interference covenant in the same stack. The management portal zeroed out my violations. The board sent a letter to the membership acknowledging the limits of its authority and describing the difference between common property and adjacent private access. It contained the word approval. The logistics company built its new gate and poured a new curb cut at the western end of their yard. They sent a thank you that was really just a sentence in a quarterly report about reduced cycle times, which is as warm a gesture as a dispatch office can make. We wound the schedule down together with the clarity of professionals who understood the deal they had signed and the reasons for unwinding it. The last rig slipped across the crown a month before the new gate went live, and the LED board came down with a sigh. I kept the reflective posts, not as a taunt, but as a memory. Later, when walkers drifted in with the sun, their reflective faces would turn that light into a soft Morse code of boundary and permission. The board president resigned at the next election and sent a final letter that emphasized her service and left out her folder and its sharp edges. A neighbor with a background in land records and a patience for agendas ran and won, promising less sprinting with binders and more reading of county websites before sending mailers. The new board's first act was to publish a Property Lines 101 resource on the portal, with direct links to the recorder's office and a How to Read Your Plat PDF. It was dull and perfect. It was exactly what this place needed. Neighbors who had filmed the early nights waved again. A few sent notes asking what they could do to help plant the green wall. A handful pretended they had never cared, which is one way to save face when your certainty melts. The couple with the porch swing thanked me indirectly by not talking about me on social media anymore. A teenager in the neighborhood, fascinated by the logistics ballet he had watched on a screen after bedtime from his upstairs window, asked his parents about internships at freight companies. Entire lives run on the momentum of late-night rigs that never enter our stories until someone tries to stop them. He had seen a seam and gotten a glimpse of what runs inside. The impact that mattered the most was quieter than the trucks. It was the way the community's language changed without admitting it had. Our path became the new path near the pond. Community connectivity became a line item with real dollars attached to it, not a euphemism for taking. Violation went back to describing lawns and shutters and holiday lights that lingered after New Year's, not attempts to rewrite someone else's deed with a pastel marker. The power walkers still looped the cul-de-sac, but they detoured where the non-interference covenant began and the easement turned daylight only and obliging. The bench reappeared well inside the HOA boundary, facing the pond this time, a better view for a better approach. The money I earned from the buyout did not distort my life, it corrected it. The night after the wire hit, I slept the same way I had slept before the first chalk message and the first pulled sign. The difference was in the morning, when the mailbox held an association newsletter that described a scheduled planting along the new path and a reminder to pick up after pets, and none of the words pretended they could change the map. The trucks no longer cut arcs of light against stucco at midnight. The sound that replaced them was ordinary, the hummed buzz of cicadas at dusk and the burst of sprinklers at proper hours. If you squinted at the story from far enough away, it looked like noise versus peace. Up close, it was paperwork versus posture. One of those wins more often than the other, when the stamp is real and the memory is recorded properly in a book that doesn't care about binders and name tags. The HOA had wanted a path. They got one, on their side of the line, paid for without pretending a vote could capture a deed. I had wanted my strip to remain mine, and to serve me or my assigns as the law had always allowed. It did. The detour through a convoy had been the costly course correction some places need to understand where the edges are. What remains in the end is the place where consequences rest. The association's reserves carry a scar that will keep board members humble for a while. The new board meets with agendas that look like roadmaps instead of manifestos. The management company sends fewer form letters and more questions marked by a willingness to listen first. My shop light glows later some nights because the upgrades turned a hobby into a small business that pays for itself. And somewhere a teen watches the churn at the logistics yard from a new angle, understanding that supply chains and statutes are both systems that work best when they're honest. The paperwork for the buyout is framed on my office wall, not as a trophy, trophy, but as a reminder that revenge stories worth listening to rarely hinge on shouting. They pivot on patience, on options, on knowing where the steel pin sits 2 inches below the soil. This one did. The pin is still there, and now there's a native hedge above it. The last page of this story isn't about paperwork. It's about the way a neighborhood breathes when it rediscovers its edges, and how people behave when convenience stops being the only god in the room. The day the HOA opened its new path with a ribbon cut by a child and not a board member, the entire place felt like it had been reset to factory settings. The dotted lines were gone. The real ones held. The closing act belongs to the lesson that everyone pretends they already knew. Ownership is not a vibe. It's a record. It isn't loud until someone makes it be. It isn't cruel unless someone insists on testing it with cheerfully printed flyers. The next chapter would not have engines. It would carry something quieter and heavier, the way a community makes rules after it's learned the cost of not reading the map before drawing one of its own. Months later, the strip read as a story etched into asphalt and paper rather than a battleground. The native hedge along the shoulders had thickened, stitching green into a soft wall that suggested privacy without a dare. The reflective posts remained, no longer sentries against a convoy, but patient punctuation marks along a sentence finally written the way it should have been. The sound-absorbing panels on the fence turned road noise into a muted backdrop, a hush that made birdsong feel closer. The gate, rebuilt and balanced, stayed shut most days, opening only for the quiet necessities of ordinary life. Deliveries, the occasional contractor, the dull hum of utility maintenance done without spectacle. The LED board, stored and dusted, waited in a corner of the shop like a retired prop. On the HOA's side, the new path curved sensibly through land the association actually owned. It wore its daylight hours like a polite collar, with signage that matched the easement's measured language. A barrier separated the path from my strip, split rail with a discreet cable set into posts, an honest line that resisted, just this once, with the same gentle firmness as a closed hand. Walkers drifted along at noon, not midnight. Kids kicked leaves and learned the feel of a boundary they could see. The stenciled bench faced the pond this time, giving people something to look at besides a fence and the idea of a shortcut that had always belonged to someone else. The management portal's personality changed. Where it once punched out violations at a pace that felt like a reflex, it now posted reminders that read as if a human had typed them. The Property Lines 101 guide lived at the top of the Resources tab, secure behind a folder labeled in prose that didn't try to perform power it didn't possess. The Risk Committee added to the board's monthly agenda kept minutes that were intentionally unexciting. The finances bore the mark of lessons learned, a scar that doubled as a reminder to count costs before setting plans to pastel paper. The new treasurer's reports read like carpentry, not theater, each figure a measured cut rather than a flourish. Neighbors calibrated. The ones who had once performed outrage through screens found something else to hold their evenings. The couple with the porch swing settled into small rituals that no longer involved filming the horizon and waiting for an amber blink. The teenager who had watched the late-night choreography from his upstairs window found a summer spot at the logistics yard, the kind of internship that teaches time as a system rather than a clock. Even the faithful power walkers adjusted their loops, veering wide at the barrier with a nod to the recorded easement's quiet conditions. It was not confession, it was compliance with reality. The former president's binder disappeared from the cul-de-sac. Her lawn chairs took on the restful look of furniture that serves its intended purpose. Some Saturday mornings, she gardened by the mailbox with the focus of someone who had decided to spend attention on things that grew instead of things that glowed on screens. The election results that nudged her out were close enough to spare grandstanding and decisive enough to invite relief. Power, once exercised with a flourish, settled into stewardship. The neighborhood breathed like a room with fresh air circulating through opened vents instead of a fan swinging too fast. The emergency thread on the portal fossilized into an archive entry. People found their old posts the way you find shirts at the back of a closet that fit a version of yourself that needed a certain swagger at the time. The thread's ending carried less ink than its middle, because most sagas end not with symbols, but with paperwork. If anyone scrolled to the close, they found a statement by the board acknowledging limits that had felt like insults months earlier. They read an apology that did the one job apologies have when they're worthwhile. It named the error without asking for applause. In the quiet that followed, homeowners read and moved on. My shop acquired the upgrade that had been waiting on the far side of patience. New wiring, a better dust collection system, a bench that ran the length of a wall and invited a long project without forcing compromises. The space grew into its potential, not as a monument to a fight, but as a beneficiary of it. Some nights the light glowed later, a steady rectangle at the back of a house that returned every morning to an ordinary pace. The money from the buyout spread thin and wide, the way it should when it's meant meant to support life rather than announce it. The county's records reflected the outcome with indifferent grace. The limited use easement's text sat beside the non-interference covenant like a pair of bookends holding up a shelf of calmer days. The recorded affidavit that had killed the implied dedication fantasy kept its volume turned down, its presence enough to deter the next person tempted to mistake footsteps for rights. The judge's denial of emergency relief lived in a database with a flood of other restrained impulses from committees and individuals who arrived breathless and left instructed. If there was a lasting echo of the convoy, it was not decibels and idle hums. It was how quickly extraordinary becomes ordinary once it meets a boundary that holds. The night trucks rolled, the neighborhood saw a spotlight show. In retrospect, the show had been a mirror. It revealed which rules lived on paper stamped in ink, and which rules lived only in newsletters designed more for tone than force. It showed that order comes not from volume, but from alignment, deed, survey, ordinance, permit, insurance, operations. Each piece of a dull machine that moves predictable loads without complaint. The board had tried to summon order by declaring it. Order had arrived when the map and the road agreed about who got to decide. A handful of little epilogues planted themselves in the space where saga had been. The county trimmed back a policy that had confused more than one homeowner about whose job it was to police boundary trees, and in doing so, eliminated a root system for conflicts that look petty until you tally their cumulative heat. The management company trained its staff on words that sound official and mean nothing without recorded instruments, dialing down the false bravery that comes from bolded text in a portal. A realtor updated their listing scripts to avoid implying that the strip acted like a neighborhood amenity, and in doing so stopped trouble before it sprouted as expectation. At dusk, the path on HOA land filled with a comfortable rhythm of footsteps and the muted roll of stroller wheels. The camera lenses in the cul-de-sac tilted down to dogs and sunsets instead of hermits and paper. The split rail barrier held a line without sentiment. The hedge grew taller. When rain came, water slipped into the swale and ran where it was supposed to run, predictable as a routine. The strip, once a stage, reverted to a quiet piece of infrastructure serving the simple purpose it had been carved to serve, long before a committee discovered clip art. If you boiled the story down to the lesson people want to pull from it, it would not taste like triumph. It would taste like patience seasoned with documentation. The things that mattered were not the parts that look good in a highlight reel. They were the minutes in the records office that smelled like toner and dust. They were the survey flags snapping on a light breeze. They were the inches of crushed base and the compaction percentages and the permit number glowing on a tablet. They were the weight of a deputy's boot finding a steel pin under a thin skin of soil. Those items don't sing when you tell the story at a barbecue. They do hold when everyone else pushes. People want villains and heroes. What they get in stories laced with HOAs and property lines is a blend of error and correction. A board mistook convenience for authority and discovered that votes don't alter recorded lines. A homeowner mistook patience for adequate defense and learned that patience needs companions named survey and permit and, sometimes, operation. A neighborhood mistook quiet for harmony and learned the deeper quiet born from boundaries respected and manuals read. None of that reads as a movie. All of it reads like adulthood. In the end, the strip taught exactly what a dull piece of infrastructure should, that function and permission matter more than feelings, and that when they align, life smooths out. The HOA got its path, on its land, paid for in full and maintained with reserve funds that acknowledge time as a solvent. I kept my right to control my access and sell its use without seeking blessings from a newsletter. The convoy stopped when the contract said it stopped and left behind nothing more complicated than the memory of a night when paper took the wheel to show everyone how maps work. Every neighborhood has its pin 2 inches below the dirt, the one point where speculation ends and steel begins. Some never have to find it. Others arrive at it eventually through force of habit or error. This place found it under LEDs and hazard lights and the hum of disciplined idle. If there is a question worth asking at the end of it all, it is not about trucks or noise or property values. It is about responsibility and attention and whether people will do the unglamorous work of reading the map before redrawing it in pastel. So when your community draws a dotted line across someone else's parcel and calls it a path, where will you put your weight, on a binder full of feelings or on the steel pin waiting in the ground?